Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. We are thrilled to welcome our arch rivals from the Brussels Sprouts podcast, Andrea Kendall-Taylor and Jim Townsend, to the Eurofile. This is going to be a cross-posted episode, so it will also appear on your Brussels Sprouts feed, which, despite being our arch rivals, you should definitely subscribe to their excellent podcast as well. Andrea Kendall-Taylor is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS. Prior to joining the Center for New American Security, Andrea served for 8 years as a senior intelligence officer, including a stint as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Jim Townsend is well known to everyone. He is an adjunct senior fellow in the CNAS Transatlantic Security Program. He was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy and completed more than 2 decades of work on European and NATO policy at the Pentagon, at NATO, and at the Atlantic Council. Andrea, Jim, great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
So we want to kind of have an open-ended conversation to sort of talk about what a second Trump term means for Europe, for European security, for Russia, for Ukraine, and, how panicked should folks in European capitals be right now? Jim, maybe we'll start with you for your kind of gut reaction and how you think this is going to sort of play out.
It's really interesting. We're just making it up as we go along each day. And so I would say that it's different than 2016 when the election of Trump happened the first time. I think everyone assumed that things would work out fine. The American president's huge to the center. Trump will do that. He's going to bring in good people from the blob, that can help him run a traditional presidency. And of course, that didn't happen. It was a very rough ride. And now he's back. And I would say in terms of reactions in Europe that I've seen, it's not so much panic as much as it is a kind of a grim determination to make this work one way or another. A lot of phone calls have come in. My understanding is the Polish president is going to be visiting or has visited already to see Trump at Mar-a-Lago. So nations are beginning to react as the sitting government kind of wants to do. Some are keeping cool. Some are rushing over to pay their respects, if you will. And everyone is just kind of buckled up and waiting because we've been through this before. And I think the European nations are that way as well. And also, it's such a different Europe now than it was in 2016. They're in a different place now. And they're beginning to really take seriously, and this was on the internet within minutes of the election results. I think European nations are really being quite serious about understanding that they do really need to be able to stand on their own feet now and to break this dependency on the U.S. and not be so tied at the hip to the U.S. that swerves every 4 years, that they need to have more of a sense of sovereignty. I know I sound like Macron right now, but it's, I think, similar.
Maybe feel a little bit, not alarmist, but more worried than you do. And you just said, we've been through this before. I'm not sure we've actually been through this before. And I worry very much that the second Trump term will look quite different than it did the first time around. Already, he's coming in, fast out of the gates, making his appointments. This is a team who has, I think, a better defined agenda and knows how government works and may be far more effective in advancing Trump's tendencies than during the first term. I think of all of the national security issues, it's the Europe, Russia, Ukraine portfolio that stands to change the most. If you think about the China file or other things, watching Rubio and now maybe this Waltz for National Security Advisor, there's probably going to be quite a bit of continuity on some sides, but there could be a lot of discontinuity on the Europe side. And Jim, you said it's a different Europe, and I understand fundamentally that it is. But looking today, I don't know that Europe is any better prepared to provide for its own security and defense than it was 3 years ago. And if Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine wasn't enough to get the Europeans going, we've now wasted these 4 years, and everyone kind of understood that Trump returning was out there in the ether and a possibility. But now here we are, and I don't think Europe is any better prepared to defend for themselves than they were 4 years ago. And that worries me quite a lot.
I agree with what you're saying, but just define better. I think what's different now is that this dependency and this idea that at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to swoop in and not do what you've laid out as far as what Trump could do. I think they've realized what you just said. So there's now more political will, I think, in Europe where they're going to say, we're way behind. We've got to really get ourselves out of this hole. I think there seems to be more of a deeper realization that that's the case. But there's leadership problems in Europe. It's weak leadership. There's a lot of wheel spinning going on. The EU, they've done something already with funding just over the past 24 hours. So what I was trying to say is that any bitter enders who are saying, I'm going to close my eyes and it's going to be okay, I don't think they're doing that anymore. So I agree with what you said, and that's part of a different Europe.
My view is I think you're both right. I think Europe is very different today than it was in 2017. In some ways, it's more prepared for a Trump administration that would pull the plug on U.S. commitment to European security. On the other hand, why hasn't more been done over the last few years is totally the right question, in particular when it comes to Ukraine, where this was sort of a known problem. You know, a year ago, U.S. aid was stuck, and there hasn't been sort of any kind of big European supplemental for Ukraine in response. Europeans oftentimes will be quick to plead poverty, and their finance ministers will be quick to plead poverty. But Europe can afford to actually support Ukraine to ramp up its defense industrial production. And the problem is they haven't acted. I think Europe is positioned to do more. That said, having not done what they needed to do to really prepare themselves, I think now they are in position mentally to take stronger action. And I think what will happen is that conversation we've been hearing from the foreign and defense ministers, but not really the finance ministers, and Europe has been not really all on the same page. I think they'll begin to be on the same page about more concerted action. In some ways, I think they're going to be forced to be put in that position because I think the Trump team is going to come in and they're going to be committed to, I think, changing the U.S. role in Europe. And I think this is like what they're planning on doing, which is that we're sick and tired of paying for European security and providing European security and having Europeans not do it and then pleading poverty. The Band-Aid is coming off, and it may come off more slowly or faster depending on, you know, what happens, but I think it's coming off. And so counterbalancing European response, I think, will be there. So I think this is going to be a very rocky period coming in transatlantic relations, but I think that extends beyond the security side. I think on tariffs, on climate, we can talk about that. But really, I see an administration that has a plan for how it wants to roll back its involvement in NATO and European security, and the Europeans are going to in some ways be forced to act.
This is what I worry about. You have a Trump administration coming in, wanting to hand security over to Europe. You can't hand European security to a Europe that is not yet capable of managing the large-scale threat that Russia is. And that's what I worry about.
No, I entirely agree. And this is why I think what is sort of not understood in the US is that it's not just that Europeans are deadbeats, it's that we have insisted that Europe not take responsibility for its defense, to not structure itself so that it's Europe doing defense. We have not wanted Europe to actually be a defense actor. We have not wanted a European pillar of NATO to exist. That is not something the US has cared about or wanted. And now we're saying, why doesn't that exist? Well, it's going to take them a very long time to get there. So there's going to be a clear gap, and I think that creates real danger.
We fostered that dependency. Our actions created a very deep dependency, and now suddenly we're going to make them go cold turkey.
Yeah, I mean, from the European side, that's part of the problem. There's a reliance on the US. There's a problem of fooling ourselves into thinking it's going to be okay. I think maybe a tendency to also want to latch onto the idea that a second Trump administration would be fine enough compared to the first one. And we see this with already some of the leaders who are ready to go pledge allegiance, let's say, to the next leader. From my perspective, of course, Ukraine is top of mind, but the thing that comes to mind for me, not on the defense side, is the implications of a Trump administration for European governance. We saw this in the first Trump administration, and things like State Department programs to support freedom of the press in parts of Europe, for example, in Hungary or in Bulgaria or places like that, pro-democracy programs suffered pretty heavily. And we're at a time where those countries really need that support. That is my concern under a second Trump administration. The amount of support that will be pulled out of pro-democracy efforts, of press freedom, anything like that, And at the same time, the support that will be given to some of these liberal leaders and parties from the bully pulpit here in Washington, D.C., because those networks have been in touch for the last 4 to 8 years, really. We know those links have grown. And I'm concerned because this is a time where Europe needs to be unified. They need to be united. They need to not have this reflexive attitude and jump to the bilateral relationship. There needs to be a unified European approach to a Trump 2 term on defense, but also on governance issues, anything like that. And for the amount of change that needs to happen at the EU, having more of these illiberal leaders and parties coming up is detrimental to that effort.
And just to make the national security implication of it, this is where some of Russia's hybrid tactics come in and this kind of escalation of all of the hybrid and direct action attacks on Europe. So you're going to have kind of the convergence of an emboldening, I think, of many of these far-right parties as a result of Trump's reelection, at the same time as you have growing Russian support and heightened Russian efforts to pressure European publics to get them to back down in their willingness to confront Russia. I mean, that's what it's about. It's, we will demonstrate to you the costs that come with supporting Ukraine. We will demonstrate to you the costs of taking anti-Russian positions. And so it does. I mean, the goal here is to make European institutions ungovernable and to ultimately weaken Europe's ability to confront Russia. And so everything that was just said, I mean, it's important from like a democracy, good governance perspective, which is important in its own right. But it also now has, I think, a really important national security element in which it can weaken the foundations and undermine the cohesiveness and coherence that will be required to contain Russia. Is unlikely to walk away from Ukraine believing that it was defeated.
Yeah, I think this is a huge challenge for the European Union. Outside powers look at Europe and say, okay, we can salami slice this. We can divide and rule. And whether that's Russia with the Hungaries or China with Hungary and others and its economic ties, but it's also the United States. Jim mentioned before, the United States used to do this when it came to EU defense initiatives, tapping the UK or the Baltics on the shoulder and saying, we don't really support this. So we have played in that as well. And I think the Trump administration will try to do that as well, divide Europe where it can. My concern is that there's also all these other areas like tech policy where, according to the EU's own regulations, it kind of has to take real action against Elon Musk's Twitter or X. On climate, the EU has all these regulations, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that are coming down the pipe that are going to run headlong into the Trump administration. And then we have trade and tariffs where the EU is taking action against Chinese EVs and then potentially going to get squeezed by the US. All of this, I think, are going to be these collisions that happen one after the other. And the question, I think, on the European side is, can Europe stay united, number one? And my question on the US side is, what do we care about? What does the Trump administration care about? Does it want to make a deal on, okay, we'll keep our forces in Europe, but you know what, you're going to have to come along with us on China, on tech, on trade. And then basically the EU has to sort of bend the knee on all these economic policy areas. My guess is that there's no real strategy, that it will just sort of be this mix of the US trying to use its leverage. And we saw this with JD Vance saying, we can't maintain our security commitment if the Europeans don't believe in free speech, a la, and are going to take action against Twitter. And so leveraging the security side of the relationship for economic leverage, but you can only use that if you're not going to actually pull back. And if they pull back, then all that leverage goes away. So I think there's going to be a lot of collisions with the EU. And then the question is whether the EU can keep its own house in order. We just had German governments collapsing. I think that's probably not the worst thing, but it's going to be a while until they come into office.
I agree with all that. And just to throw on the table, too, that I'm concerned about unity, not just within the EU, but also within NATO. Because if Putin believes that this next 4 years is really his opportunity to humiliate NATO in a lot of ways, particularly given Orban and Fico in Slovakia, who are sitting at the neck and not joining consensus on things. So if they make a Narva grab kind of thing, or they do something that has an ally coming to NATO under Article 4 and saying, hey, I feel I've been attacked here and there, the idea that NATO unity will fall in behind them, including the United States, it's all of a sudden become a weaker bet that the US or the other allies will be there and unity will fall in behind Estonia or somebody. And that worries me too, as we look into the next few years, is this idea that NATO can agree on the way ahead, not even on something as dire as an Article 5, but something else where we need to be doing things and suddenly it becomes turbulent struggling in the neck because the Orban's not playing ball and Trump's not playing ball. And that's just going to really undermine the alliance.
Well, I want to throw a question out to the three of you on this, just because it's a question I've received, not just from friends who know I work here in DC, who know I work in European affairs, but also from friends at home and people in my family is, can Trump/will Trump take the US out of NATO? Let's talk about the worst case scenarios. What does that look like in practice?
So my guess is there's not an effort to fully pull the U.S. out of NATO. But what I think we'll start to see, and I'm very curious on what Jim thinks here, is that I think we'll start to see reduction of U.S. forces. Anything that has any relevance to the Indo-Pacific, I think will get moved. And I could see that being done in a fairly deliberate way, where we're doing this, it's sort of announced right away, get ready for fewer U.S. forces in Europe. And then I think the next question is, do they really dial down U.S. participation in NATO? I don't know when Christopher Cavoli's term is up as SACEUR in U.S. European Command, but do they appoint a replacement? Do they appoint a NATO ambassador? Are they deliberately trying to sort of reduce American influence and involvement in Europe? In some ways, it's sort of bizarre because by just appointing people, we have all this influence, and why would we want to lose it? But, I think trying to sort of identify what's their strategy to actually send the signal that U.S. involvement in European security is going down and is not going to be there, I think is going to be interesting. And I would look at force levels. Jim probably has a lot more in the weeds views on this.
Well, I think a lot of this is timing. There's always a NATO mini summit in the spring after an election so that the allies can meet the new American president. If you remember the last one that they did with Trump, when they did Trump's mini summit, that's when he had the famous press conference out there in the courtyard and just shocked everybody by what he was saying, if you remember that. And you could see in the background, the allies were looking at each other going, whoa, and they were kind of laughing a little bit. I mean, it was just like, it was terrible. It was just a shock. So I think this time around, and this goes to what Andrea was saying too, it's a different Trump, and I think he knows NATO better. It's a different NATO, et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot of this is timing. He's an opportunist. He doesn't have a strategy or an ideology going into this. So he won't even be thinking about NATO until he's kind of forced to, because he's going to be looking at the border. He's going to be looking at tariffs. He's going to be looking at that first. Eventually, though, this summit is going to be coming upon them, and they'll have to say, so what are we going to say to NATO? Mark Rutte, the new section, has a pretty good relationship with Trump based on when Rutte was the prime minister in the Netherlands. So there's that. There's not a reason the way there was a reason 4 years ago because he didn't like Merkel. He went in not liking NATO. He went in with a proclivity to want to leave NATO. I think his opinion has changed somewhat. I think the idea that the allies aren't spending enough on defense, that's been diluted a bit because there has been a change in that. And so there's not necessarily an incoming reason for him to temper tantrum and to pull out. But at the same time, I think he does want to send signals. I think he does want to send signals that he's still not happy with Europe. And so I think we will see that manifest itself in the first year by a real slow roll in terms of putting an ambassador there. And then eventually, maybe he'll put an ambassador in there, but someone more like Stefanik, who's going to the UN. He might put in a skeptic, a NATO skeptic in there.
Jim, let me ask you just specifically. So, could he presumably, or a Trump official, go at NATO and say, okay, the NATO defense planning process, which then assumes that the U.S. is going to provide X number of assets, like we're going to provide, these air tankers and all these things. And basically they go in and say, all these things that you think we're providing, we're not going to provide that. That's on you now. And creating sort of real defense planning gaps. Is that an area that they could go?
They certainly could, but I think there would need to be a big reason for it. That's a real nuclear option, so to speak, and I'm not sure he's there yet. Merkel's not there, and that was a real hot button for him. And it's the same thing with force structure. You mentioned that. Would he begin to pull force structure? I think one of the things he might do is go ahead and go back to that pulling forces out of Germany and putting them in Poland, only because that wasn't done. And out of pique, I could see him coming in and saying, okay, we're going to do this. You guys slow rolled me last time, but we're moving it. Even though Merkel's not there and it was to punish Germany at the time. I don't know where his head is on Germany now, but I could see him in terms of force posture going ahead and making that move just to kind of tell the Pentagon, I'm the boss here, not you guys. One big point, though, is this. A lot of what he might do in Europe, whether it's force posture or whether it's at NATO, is based on his relationship with Putin. And this is where Andrea, I think, could give us some insight. I think he feels that relationship is very important to him. And I'm not sure where it's going, but he likes to be in the presence of strong men. He looks on Putin as someone that he kind of admires in some twisted way. And so I think if this is part of his thinking in terms of Ukraine and Russia and what a deal could look like, maybe it's a bit of a broader thing where Putin comes to him and says, okay, X, Y, and Z on Ukraine, but I want to see the U.S. reduce its force presence in Europe because I see that as a threat to me. And Trump says, okay, Putin, you got it. I will move some stuff to the Pacific, or I will bring them home, or whatever. So I think a lot of how this is going to unfold in the next year is going to be based on NATO coming back on the radar for him because he's got the summit, which he may not show up to as well. That might be another signal. He says, I'm going to send JD Vance. I don't have time to do NATO stuff. So that NATO summit is going to put NATO things on his radar. His relationship with Putin is going to put things on his radar in terms of force posture or other European security related stuff that might be of interest to Putin that he wants Trump to change. And then Ukraine-Russia deal is going to put things on the table earlier on that could impact U.S. force posture or European security. So it's all interrelated. So I don't see him pulling out of NATO. There's too much leverage for him, I think, with NATO. He has over the allies, or he's got over Putin. If he does something as drastic as pulling out of NATO, he'll want to get something big for that from Putin or at home or something. So I don't see him making a big drastic move like that, at least not in the first year.
But just a friendly reminder, and Max, this is your original point about leverage. I'm looking at a Twitter post that says JD Vance says US could drop support for NATO if Europe tries to regulate Elon Musk's platforms. These are the things. This is the leverage.
Yeah, and we'll see how that plays out. I mean, I think from an EU perspective, if you just saw the US elections and, the richest man in the world buying a social media platform, using that social media platform to advance his political agenda, I mean, it's literally why they created their regulations. So of what Europe is about, my sense is that when you challenge the survival of the European Union, as Brexit did, for instance, and the UK thought it could also divide and conquer and in negotiations with the EU when it was leaving, and it found out it couldn't, the EU actually comes together in crises. That's sort of my general take. Now we'll see. I think they can wield an internal hammer potentially against Viktor Orban by withholding lots of funds, and there could be lots of sort of things done behind the curtain there that prevent him really undermining the EU at every turn. But we'll see. That, I think, is exactly the threat that the Trump administration is going to use the security leverage on all these other areas, at the same time undermining the security leverage by telling Europe to get its act together. I think it's going to be a confusing mess, but maybe we should pivot to Russia, Ukraine. Jim, you sort of introduced it with Trump's ties to Russia. Maybe let's start with the kind of big topic question of day one. Trump says he's going to try to have peace in Ukraine. Andrea, I'm curious what you make of all of this and of Trump's efforts here, and how nervous should the Ukrainians be, and the Europeans be for that matter, about these overtures?
There's a lot of information out there to wade through, not least, this report in the Washington Post about a Trump-Putin phone call, but then the Russians have denied it. So I guess it's still early days, and it's very difficult to wade through what's happening, what's not happening. The one thing that seems to be out there was the Trump call with Zelensky, where Trump has then kind of put forward his starting position, which is freeze the line as it is, take away the possibility of NATO membership for Ukraine for 20 years, but continue to equip and arm the Ukrainians to defend themselves going into the future. So, in a broad brush sense, I'm not sure in terms of those broad contours that things would have looked so different under a Harris administration. I think she would have said it differently. There would have been a different way of saying no NATO membership for 20 years. It wouldn't have been said in that way. But I think the broad contours maybe wouldn't have been so different under Harris. It's hard to know what she would have done. Her positions weren't exceptionally clear. But I think the devil then is going to be in the details. And I think when Trump and when Washington goes and pushes forward, if they do along these lines, they're going to be met very quickly with a Putin who is still very dead set in his maximalist aims. When we say we're going to equip Ukraine, well, Putin's one of his objectives is the demilitarization of Ukraine. So what is it that Putin would actually agree to that the United States would be able to continue? Would they allow Ukraine to continue to build its own defense industry and produce long-range munitions that can strike into Russian territory? I don't know. When you look at what Putin is talking about, he talks about neutrality. So I'm not even sure he's going to be happy with a 20-year moratorium. He wants constitutional neutrality, but he also wants very significantly to limit the size and the capabilities of Ukraine's military. Is that something that the Trump administration would be willing to sign up to? He'll probably ask for sanctions relief. Is that something that we're going to be willing to sign up to that would then presumably allow Putin, in theory, to pocket those concessions and build up more quickly for future aggressive actions against Europe and European security? So I don't know. I have a really hard time wading through Trump's rhetoric about ending this. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. The last thing I'll say is Putin was speaking at Valdai after the election, and there does seem to be a shift in the way that he's talking about Ukraine, trying to appear as more interested in peace negotiations, much less hostile rhetoric towards the so-called West. So it looks like he's trying to differentiate between the good West and the bad West. So I think Putin is also trying to feel his way through this. At the very least, it does seem like he feels like there's the possibility that there could be some sort of agreement that would be on terms far more favorable to Russia than would have been possible under a Harris administration. So I guess it's all a long way of saying it's very hard to tell. The bottom line is I am exceptionally worried that given the trajectory that the conflict is on and the current state of discussions about a negotiated settlement, Russia will not believe that it was defeated in Ukraine. It's going to walk away believing that it gained something. And that is a Russia that I think we have to worry about.
I'm really pessimistic about any potential negotiations, in part because I'm like, what's in it for Russia? What's in it for Putin? Why would Putin sit down in negotiations with Ukraine when there's no real U.S. commitment to continue funding support for Ukraine? And the Europeans aren't right now, as we speak, mobilizing lots of money to try to figure out ways to narrow the gap that would exist between a shortfall U.S. funding and European money and defense production ramping up. He can win the war. Right? The war is on a good trajectory for him. There's North Koreans coming to fight with him. They're getting resupplied by North Korea and Iran. There's Chinese defense industrial helping to maintain Russian defense production. And yeah, the Russian economy, has showing signs of strain. But another year of this, this war of attrition looks like a war that Russia could win. So for Russia to sort of pull back, I think there has to be something really in it for him. And I'm struggling to see what that might be. Now, I could see Russia engaging in sort of performative negotiations where they make it look like they're sort of reasonable, engaging in talks. And maybe they're like, well, we're not going to engage in talks if the U.S. is going to provide more money for Ukraine. So I'm really pessimistic about the negotiation part. I also don't see who in the Trump administration is a Russia hand that is going to have the bandwidth to really engage in sort of a Dayton-style peace agreement. But the other aspect of this is I think Rubio and Waltz seem like probably as good as Ukraine could hope for. Rubio, a known Russia hawk, was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee that produced a very damaging report about Donald Trump and his campaign in August of 2020. Rubio voted against Ukraine funding. So did Waltz. And why did they do that? Well, to cut through the BS, they did it because they didn't want to get crosswise with Trump. So I think the big question is, can you convince Trump that there needs to be another 60 billion or whatever the amount is, Ukraine supplemental, to keep the arms flowing so that Russia recognizes that this war ain't going to end, that the U.S. support will be there, European support will be there. And if you can do that, then I think you could bring Putin to the table. But without that, the light at the end of the tunnel, I think, has gotten brighter for Putin in Ukraine.
I don't think Putin wants to keep fighting the war. And if he could accomplish his political objectives through political means, then that would be the preferred path. The war is not going to end on day one, so we can kind of dispense with that silliness. But if the United States does weaken support for Ukraine, I think the Russian calculation would be that, eventually Ukraine is going to have elections. You're going to have internal divisions. There's going to be a class of Ukrainian political leadership that is going to have no choice but to chart a more reasonable, pragmatic path. Trump's position is a starting point, and Putin would then believe that he could accomplish more of his objectives. I don't think he's going to back away. That's not to say he's going to say, Trump's in office, I'm going to ease up. Let's not forget that there's now 50,000 Russian soldiers amassing, ready to retake Kursk and make a major push. So I would expect the Russians to try to use this interim period to increase their leverage on the battlefield. And then with the vision of going into some sort of negotiation from an even stronger position, and believing that if the United States weakens its position for Ukraine, it's going to catalyze morale problems inside Ukraine, fatigue with the war, and that there will be a more political path towards accomplishing what he's trying to accomplish.
I agree with both you guys on this. And I'm going to just throw one more thing on the riddle here. And that is Putin has classified, this war as between him and US or him and NATO. It's seen as there's a bigger war aims, or there's a bigger aspect to this war than just Ukraine, Russia. And so I'm wondering is if one of his goals might be that he'd be willing to cut a deal that's not all of Ukraine. He'd be willing to go ahead and go to the table if he can put on the table as well what he's talked about for a long time, which is a European security architecture that doesn't involve the US. Maybe he might put the whole loaf on that table and say, look, I will make peace now instead of, dragging this thing out. I'll actually make peace right now, but I will do it only if on the table is agreement on a broader outlines of a European security architecture that is Europe focused, that takes the hot buttons and threats to Russia off the table. Maybe NATO goes away or whatever. But, he's talked about this.
His letter to Biden in December 2021, that's what he'll sort of, I think, wave in the air to Trump and say, you got to give me something to come to this table. And that's something. And I think that would scare the crap out of the Eastern Europeans and really, I think, catalyze some of the kind of European defense integration or efforts that we were talking about earlier. Maybe we'll do a round robin closing thoughts on some areas to watch out for. Maybe I'll start. And just in transatlantic relations or other closing ideas you have, I think China is going to be a really interesting issue in transatlantic relations, in part because, I've always been very dismissive of the notion that China could ever wedge the US and Europe. But if the Trump administration goes and is sort of pulling back on the security side, is confronting Europe on tech policy, on climate, on trade, the climate one in particular, pulling out of Paris, that hits especially younger Europeans really hard. And the leverage that the Europeans have is that maybe they just don't align with us on China, that we're pushing this incredibly hawkish direction and the Europeans sort of drift away and they're, in some ways gettable. And gettable, I don't mean like align with China, but they're playing sort of both sides the way you see countries like Turkey, the way you see other middle powers playing this. And I think that that's something the Trump administration needs to be on guard with. Maybe we'll go around the horn and we'll go to Jim.
I guess for me, what to look out for is with Trump in the White House now, and with there being weak European leadership, there's a lot of wheel spinning there. There's a recognition now of the crisis by so many more people in Europe now than in the past. So you have Trump in the White House for 4 years. You've got this wheel spinning in Europe in terms of trying to get their strength back up. If Putin could get Ukraine out of the way, one way or another, we were talking about what the negotiation could look like. And if he does that soon in the first year, that gives Putin a kind of this 4-year window to take whatever next step he feels he wants to take in terms of humiliating NATO by doing a Narva grab kind of thing, taking Georgia, Moldova, whatever's on his to-do list to recreate Imperial Russia or Communist Russia or whatever he feels his destiny is. The price is going to be cheaper to him to do this over the next 4 years, particularly if he can get Ukraine out of the way. So that might be another driver for him to have a peace agreement, if you will, or a ceasefire or something, is to get that off his plate so he can focus on whatever next level move that he wants to make. And that's what worries me. This is a 4-year window when it won't get any better than this. Trump in the White House, a weak and wheel-spinning Europe, and a Russian military that's gotten bigger and stronger, more battle-hardened, economy that's on a war footing in Russia. He's got total control in Russia. This is a 4-year window where he can make good on whatever his fantasies are. And that's what worries me.
And Europe, in some ways, is going to be somewhat alone in confronting the Russia threat. Danetian, thoughts from you?
What I'm going to be keeping my eye on and rebounding on this conversation is whether this can be a catalyst for European transformation. And I don't just mean defense. I mean, for reforms that we know are necessary to the European budget, to the enlargement process, to how the Commission actually stands up to anti-democratic or liberal leaders from inside. I really see two paths for this election's impact on European unity. One is everybody just devolves into a bilateral food fest. The other one really is this is a shock to the system. We need to do this together. As you said, also, they're going to feel pretty alone on a lot of policy issues from climate to tech policy. And for example, even things like trade and industrial policy. We've heard Robert Lighthizer might be back as USTR. This might be the push that some leaders in Europe were hoping for to get the upper hand on trade policy to say, this is why we need a European approach to this. We can talk about free market all we want, which, a lot of the Nordics want to do, but this is not the world we live in. So let's be a lot more forward leaning on this. I'm really curious to see if they can muster that. And part of why I'm thinking now maybe the unity path is not guaranteed, but maybe a tiny bit more hope for it is the movements we're seeing in Germany, because before Lindner's departure, I think we were just staring at a coalition that was completely stuck in its own domestic problems. And maybe now Scholz feels like he'll have some of the domestic policy space to make some big moves. That means a lot of changes potentially in 2025.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, particularly on trade. Kaja Kallas had our hearings today to be confirmed as the next EU High Representative. That's basically the EU Secretary of State or Foreign Minister. And she highlighted the importance of the EU-Mercosur trade deal as not just for economic purposes, but geopolitical. And I could see the EU re-engaging in CPTPP and doing a lot more in the kind of global trade space. And Jim mentioned earlier that the EU has already announced that EU cohesion funds, which is like 1/3 of the EU budget, can now be potentially used for defense purposes. Opens up a potential big pot of funding that could be accessed to things that apply to kind of boost European defense. So there's some moves already happening. We'll see if they continue. But Andrea, over to you.
I guess a little bit of a smattering of random thoughts. What I'm thinking about / watching are like, what are the arguments that can be made to get the Trump administration to not look past the Russia problem? And I think, China, for obvious reasons, is going to remain the dominant threat. But looking at some of these appointments with Rubio as potentially Secretary of State and Waltz as the National Security Advisor, both China hawks. And so I think there's going to be a major imperative to remain laser focused on China. And the worry then is that if we're signaling less interest in Europe, only wanting to do China, that's also something that emboldens Putin along the lines of what Jim was just talking about. The things to think about are trying to make the point to the Trump administration, but also really Europeans, that the costs of resisting Russia are only going to rise. And there are some straightforward investments that the United States and Europe could make today to ensure that the threat we face tomorrow remains much more of a manageable one. So investing in the things that the United States not be willing to bring, like the enablers, the heavy lift, the air-to-air refueling, those are easy steps that as Europeans are increasing defense spending, they could make those investments today to ensure that we can maintain a credible deterrent if for some reason the United States doesn't have the political will, for whatever reason, to come to Europe's defense. The costs will only rise, so make these prudent investments today. The other piece is the axis of upheaval. I think that Trump is aware and not happy about the growing coordination and cooperation among Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So trying to help this administration see the utility in pushing back against Russia, getting Ukraine right, and why that's so critical for managing this problem presented by the axis of upheaval. And I guess then the last thing is there's been a lot of talk, there always is with the new administration, about how you're going to prioritize. But the argument that I would also want to make, it's not just about prioritization, but also about sequencing. And so how do you talk to the incoming administration about doing a couple of small things to ensure that European security is on a solid footing, and then being able to pivot much more fully aggressively towards taking on China and doing what you want there. So prioritization is important, but we have to think about the sequencing. And the point I made earlier is even though we might want to hand over European security to the Europeans, we can't because they're not yet ready. They don't have the capabilities to handle. So are there small things that we could do today to get European security on the right path? And then that allows us to more fully pivot maybe the way that they would like to.
Yeah. And hopefully a new Trump administration, if they want to earnestly sort of shift the burden for European security to Europeans, want to do that in a kind of responsible manner that happens as fast as possible, but also make sure that there's no yawning gaps. And I think there's ways to do that. We'll see if they end up doing it. We're unfortunately out of time. Andrea, Jim, Donatien, it's been great to play jazz with all of you as we react to Trump's re-election. This has been a special podcast of the Eurofile and also the great Brussels Sprouts podcast. If you are a listener to either, please subscribe to the other. And Jim, Andrea, hope to continue this conversation with you guys again soon.